The year is 62 BC. The most powerful man in Rome, Julius Caesar, is absent from his mansion on this cold February evening, attending to political matters in the distant provinces. Inside his home, shadows dance across marble walls as oil lamps flicker in the darkness. You can hear the soft rustle of silk stolas, the gentle clink of wine cups, and hushed feminine voices echoing through corridors that normally ring with the heavy footsteps of senators and generals. Tonight, this house belongs entirely to women, but not just any women. These are the most influential matrons of Rome: Caesar's wife Pompeii, his formidable mother Aurelia, and dozens of others whose husbands control armies and provinces. They've gathered for one of the most sacred and secretive rituals in the Roman calendar, the festival of Bona Dea, the good goddess. What's about to unfold in Caesar's home would make a modern observer's jaw drop. These respectable Roman ladies are about to drink undiluted wine, something strictly forbidden to women in daily life, sacrifice a pregnant pig, and engage in rituals so mysterious that even today, 2,000 years later, scholars can only guess at their true nature. You smell the sharp iron scent of sacrificial blood mixing with the sweet aroma of burning incense. The air thrums with an electric tension because everyone present knows that what they're doing tonight exists in a world completely separate from Roman law, Roman marriage, and Roman men. This is a universe where women write their own rules, where the normal social order dissolves like salt in wine. But here's what history books won't tell you. This scene of female religious autonomy, with its intoxicating blend of sexuality and spirituality, represents just one thread in a vast tapestry of Roman festivals that transformed human desire into divine worship. For over 7 centuries, from the 1st century BCE to the 6th century CE, the Romans didn't just tolerate public displays of sexuality, they sanctified them, turning fertility, desire, and even nudity into acts of religious devotion that they believed essential for the survival of their empire. Tonight, you're about to discover how the world's most powerful civilization built an entire religious calendar around practices that would scandalize modern sensibilities. We'll walk through streets where naked priests whipped women with goat hide for good luck, where prostitutes performed mock gladiator combat in honor of fertility goddesses, and where elite Romans commissioned erotic frescoes not for private pleasure, but as spiritual protection for their families. This isn't the sanitized version of Roman history you learned in school. This is the raw, unvarnished truth about how an entire empire turned sexual expression into sacred duty. Like Victorian archaeologists who discovered Pompeii's explicit artwork and quickly locked it away in secret museum cabinets, we've spent centuries hiding the uncomfortable reality that ancient Rome's religious life was saturated with sexuality. But recent archaeological discoveries are forcing us to confront this hidden history. In 2024 alone, excavations in Pompeii uncovered new erotic frescoes depicting mythological scenes of desire, while advanced analysis of Herculaneum scrolls revealed philosophical texts celebrating sensual pleasure as divinely ordained. Just this past year, archaeologists discovered a Dionysian mystery cult fresco spanning 3 walls of a Pompeian banquet hall, proof that secretive fertility rituals continued even after they were officially banned. If you imagine Roman religion as stern sacrifices to Jupiter and Mars, you're seeing only half the picture. The other half pulsed with festivals where boundaries dissolved, between sacred and profane, between male and female, between civilization and wildness. These weren't fringe cults practiced in hidden corners. They were state-sponsored celebrations that drew senators and slaves, merchants and prostitutes, all united in their belief that sexual energy could channel divine power. This story begins on a frozen February morning in 44 BC, when a young Roman priest named Marcus Antonius, later known to history as Mark Antony, strips naked in front of thousands of spectators and prepares to run through the streets of Rome. His muscular body gleams with the fresh blood of sacrificed goats, and in his hand he carries strips of hide that he'll use to strike any woman brave enough to step into his path. The crowd roars its approval as he takes his first step into what will become one of the most politically charged religious festivals in Roman history. But Antony isn't performing some barbaric ritual from Rome's primitive past. He's participating in Lupercalia, one of the most prestigious and carefully orchestrated religious celebrations in the Roman calendar. In just a few hours, this same naked, blood-smeared priest will offer Julius Caesar a golden crown in front of the entire Roman people, a moment that Shakespeare immortalized and that historians still debate today. The man running naked through Rome with goat blood on his forehead would soon help rule the known world. The cave where this festival begins still exists today, 50 feet below the ruins of Augustus's palace on the Palatine Hill. Italian archaeologists discovered it in 2007, though they debate whether this limestone grotto, decorated with seashells and mosaics, is truly the legendary Lupercal, where Romulus and Remus were nursed by a she-wolf. What's not in dispute is that for over 5 centuries this cave served as ground zero for one of Rome's most important fertility festivals. Picture the scene as it unfolds that February morning. 2 young priests, the Luperci, descend into the sacred cave carrying a dog and several male goats, animals chosen specifically for their sexual potency. The sacrifice is swift and ritualistic. Using the bloody knife, they smear the foreheads of 2 naked youth who are required to laugh throughout this ordeal. Then, in a detail that reveals the festival's deep agricultural roots, they wipe away the blood with wool dipped in milk, a gesture connecting the urban ritual to its pastoral origins, when Romans were still shepherds tending flocks on the 7 hills. The real spectacle begins when the Luperci, their naked bodies glistening with oil and blood, burst from the cave carrying leather thongs cut from the sacrificed goatskins. They race through Rome's streets, following a route that takes them past the city's most sacred sites. But this isn't just a foot race, it's a fertility ritual of staggering boldness. As they run, they strike anyone within reach with their goat-hide whips. But women actively seek out these blows, believing that being touched by the sacred thongs will ensure pregnancy and ease childbirth. What makes this scene even more remarkable is who's participating. These aren't desperate plebeians grasping for any hope of divine intervention. The Luperci themselves come from Rome's most distinguished families, the Quintiliani and the Fabiani, names that echo through Roman political history. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar even created a 3rd college, the Juliani, with Mark Antony as its first leader. This means that Rome's future consuls, senators, and generals are sprinting naked through the city, whipping women in broad daylight, all in the name of religious duty. The festival's sexual implications become even more explicit when you examine the archaeological evidence from Pompeii. A 3rd century mosaic discovered by scholar Keith Hopkins shows what Lupercalia looked like when it began losing its voluntary character. The image depicts 2 men forcibly holding a naked woman, while a 3rd man, only partially clothed, whips her thighs. The woman's face shows clear pain, while the men display what Hopkins describes as drunken hilarity. This mosaic, dating to over a century after Caesar's time, suggests that what began as a joyful fertility ritual had evolved into something darker and more coercive. Yet even this disturbing evidence reveals something crucial about Roman sexuality and religion. They were never separate spheres. Roman gods weren't ethereal beings divorced from human experience. They were passionate, sexual, often violent entities whose worship required humans to embrace their own primal natures. Faunus, the deity honored at Lupercalia, was himself a figure of unbridled sexuality. Roman mythology describes him pursuing his own daughter with such persistence that he made her drunk and beat her with myrtle branches before transforming into a serpent to seduce her. The festival reaches its crescendo when the runners converge on the Forum, Rome's political and religious heart. Here, covered in sweat and blood, they complete their circuit as thousands of spectators cheer. Some women in the crowd nurse the welts left by the sacred thongs, convinced they've just received divine blessing. Others display their fresh wounds as proud marks of the goddess's favor. For the Romans watching this spectacle, there's nothing shameful or degrading about what they're witnessing. They're seeing religion in its most potent form, raw, visceral, transformative. This isn't the only example of Roman festivals blending sexuality with sacred duty. 6 miles outside Rome, smoke rises from incense braziers in another female-only religious celebration, but this one serves a very different purpose. We're standing in one of the most heavily guarded religious compounds in the Roman world, where even the whisper of a male voice could result in death. This is the Bona Dea sanctuary, and tonight the most powerful women in Rome are about to shatter every social convention their society holds sacred. The December festival of Bona Dea represents one of the most radical religious institutions in Roman history. Twice a year, once in May at her public temple, and once in December at a private ceremony, Roman women gathered to worship a goddess whose very name was forbidden to speak aloud. The December ritual, held in the home of Rome's chief magistrate, created a temporary matriarchy in the heart of the patriarchal empire. For one night, women ruled absolutely. The preparations alone reveal how extraordinary this festival was. Days before the ceremony, the magistrate's house undergoes a complete transformation. Every image of a male deity is veiled or removed. Even paintings and sculptures depicting men are covered with cloth. The house becomes a feminine universe, where masculine presence, even in artistic representation, is forbidden. Wine jars are brought in, but they're labeled as containing milk, a semantic fiction that allows the women to consume alcohol while maintaining the pretense of ritual purity. Recent archaeological analysis has revealed fascinating details about these ceremonies. Excavations at provincial Bonadea temples show rooms that functioned as dispensaries, suggesting that healing rituals formed part of the worship. The goddess was associated not just with fertility, but with medical knowledge, areas where Roman women held unofficial but significant influence despite their legal restrictions. The layout of these temples, with perimeter walls concealing inner courtyards, demonstrates that secrecy was built into their very architecture. When the festival begins, the transformation is complete. The wife of the Pontifex Maximus becomes the ceremony's leader, wielding authority that no Roman woman could exercise in public life. The Vestal Virgins, those guardians of Rome's sacred flame, play crucial roles in rituals that remain mysterious even today. What we know comes from hostile male observers and later Christian critics, sources hardly reliable for understanding what really happened when Roman women claimed religious autonomy. The centerpiece of the ceremony involves the sacrifice of a pregnant sow, an offering that violated multiple Roman conventions. First, female priests performing sacrifice was extraordinarily rare in Roman religion. Second, the choice of a pregnant animal emphasized fertility and potential life in ways that made even Romans uncomfortable. Third, the sacrifice was followed by the consumption of undiluted wine, something forbidden to Roman women in almost every other context. But it's what happened after the sacrifice that truly shattered social norms. The women would celebrate with music, dancing, and wine, lots of wine. Archaeological evidence from houses where these festivals were held shows rooms decorated with vine leaves and ivy, sacred to Bacchus, and associated with intoxication and ecstasy. Some scholars argue that the Bona Dea festival included elements borrowed from the Dionysiac mysteries, those secret initiation rites that had been banned by the Senate in 186 BC for their alleged sexual excesses. The festival's power becomes clear when you consider who attended. These weren't marginalized women seeking escape from oppression. They were the wives, mothers, and daughters of Rome's ruling class. Caesar's wife Pompeii, his mother Aurelia, and dozens of other women whose husbands controlled legions and provinces gathered to worship in ways that inverted every principle of Roman social order. For one night, they became the priestesses, the leaders, the decision-makers. They drank freely, spoke without male oversight, and participated in rituals that remained their exclusive secret. The most famous Bona Dea festival in history occurred in December 62 BC, when the ceremony held at Caesar's house was invaded by Publius Clodius Pulcher, a young aristocrat who disguised himself as a woman to spy on the proceedings. His discovery created a scandal that rocked Roman society and ultimately led to Caesar divorcing his wife. Not because anyone believed Pompeii had done anything wrong, but because, as Caesar famously declared, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. The incident reveals how seriously Romans took these female religious spaces and how threatening they found the idea of male infiltration. What makes the Bona Dea cult particularly fascinating is how it survived and adapted. Despite official restrictions and later Christian persecution, inscriptions from the imperial period show the goddess being worshipped across the empire. She appears on dedications as Augusta and Domina, titles suggesting imperial support. Private dedications, particularly from slaves and freedmen, far outnumber elite offerings, indicating that her appeal crossed class boundaries. Some inscriptions feature paired serpents, symbols linking her to domestic protection and fertility. evidence that this goddess of female autonomy also guarded Roman homes and families. Modern excavations have revealed that some provincial Bona Dea temples remained active healing centers into the 4th century CE, suggesting that even as Christianity gained power, Romans continued to seek out this goddess for medical and spiritual aid. The cult's persistence indicates that it filled needs for female religious authority, for healing knowledge, for community among women that mainstream Roman religion couldn't address. The connection between sexuality and Roman religious festivals becomes even more explicit when we examine the spring celebration of Flora, goddess of flowers and fertility. Every year from April 28 to May 3, Rome transformed into a carnival of sexual license that would make Mardi Gras look subdued. During Floralia, prostitutes took center stage in religious ceremonies that celebrated fertility, sexuality, and the renewal of life. But this wasn't a marginal celebration. It was a state-sponsored festival that drew participants from every level of Roman society. Picture the scene in the Circus Maximus during Floralia. The vast arena, which could hold 250,000 spectators, reverberates with cheers as naked prostitutes dance across the sand. But they're not simply entertaining the crowds, they're performing religious rituals in honor of Flora, whose worship required the celebration of sexual pleasure and fertility. The women engage in mock gladiator combat, wielding wooden weapons as they fight for the amusement of the gods and the crowd. To Roman eyes, this spectacle represents divine worship at its most authentic, joyful, uninhibited, and life-affirming. Recent analysis of Roman religious calendars shows that Floralia wasn't an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of spring festivals celebrating fertility and sexual renewal. The timing was crucial. These celebrations occurred just as the agricultural season began, when farmers needed divine blessing for successful crops and abundant harvests. By honoring Flora through displays of sexuality and fertility, Romans believed they were ensuring the prosperity of their fields and the continuation of their society. The festival's religious significance becomes clearer when you examine its mythological foundation. Flora was no minor deity, but a powerful goddess whose favor Romans desperately needed. According to Ovid, she had once been the nymph Chloris, transformed into a goddess when the west wind Zephyrus fell in love with her. In her divine form, she controlled the blooming of flowers, the fertility of crops, and the renewal of life itself. Worshipping her through sexual celebration wasn't debauchery, it was practical religion, ensuring that the goddess would bless Rome with abundance. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum reveals how deeply these fertility festivals penetrated Roman domestic life. Houses throughout these cities contain frescoes depicting Flora and her sacred prostitutes, suggesting that wealthy Romans commissioned these images as spiritual protection for their families. One recently discovered fresco shows Flora surrounded by dancing figures in various states of undress, their bodies painted in vibrant colors that still gleam after 2,000 years. These weren't pornographic decorations, but religious icons, as sacred to their owners as crucifixes would be to later Christians. The festival reached its climax with theatrical performances that pushed the boundaries of public decency even by Roman standards. During Floralia, actresses, who in Roman society were considered barely distinguishable from prostitutes, performed nude on stage. The plays themselves often involved sexual themes and explicit dialogue that would normally be forbidden in public venues. Roman authors describe audiences shouting demands for performers to strip completely naked, a request that was not only granted but considered religiously appropriate during Flora's festival. What makes these performances particularly significant is their audience. Roman theatrical events weren't entertainment for the masses, but sophisticated cultural affairs attended by senators, wealthy merchants, and educated elites. During Floralia, these same aristocrats who spent the rest of the year maintaining strict social hierarchies cheered for naked prostitutes and applauded sexual performances. The festival created a temporary suspension of normal social rules, a licensed chaos that Romans believed necessary for spiritual and social renewal. The goddess Flora herself embodied this paradox. She was simultaneously a pure nature deity associated with flowers and growth, and a patron of prostitutes and sexual license. Roman religious thinking didn't find this contradiction troubling. Instead, They saw sexuality and fertility as different aspects of the same divine force. Flora's prostitutes weren't degraded women exploiting themselves for male pleasure. They were priestesses, channeling the goddess's power through their bodies and their sexuality. This integration of sexuality into state religion becomes even more remarkable when you examine how Romans incorporated erotic imagery into their most sacred spaces. Recent archaeological work has revolutionized our understanding of how Romans viewed sexual imagery in religious contexts. Far from being hidden or shameful, erotic art appeared in temples, public buildings, and private homes as a form of spiritual protection. The most striking example comes from recent excavations in Region 9 of Pompeii, where archaeologists uncovered a house containing some of the finest erotic frescoes ever discovered. The paintings, dating to the 1st century CE, depict mythological scenes of divine seduction with an artistic sophistication that rivals any Roman art. One shows Leda and the Swan, Zeus in disguise seducing the Spartan queen who would give birth to Helen of Troy. Another depicts Venus and Adonis in an intimate embrace, their bodies intertwined in a composition that celebrates both divine love and human sexuality. What makes these discoveries revolutionary is their context. These aren't hidden pornographic images tucked away in private chambers. They're prominently displayed in reception areas where guests would immediately see them. The house's owner commissioned these expensive frescoes not for personal arousal, but as spiritual protection for his family. In Roman thinking, images of divine sexuality channeled beneficial supernatural forces that would guard the household against evil and ensure its fertility and prosperity. This practice wasn't limited to private homes. Archaeologists have discovered erotic imagery in Roman temples, public baths, and government buildings throughout the empire. A recent discovery at Herculaneum revealed a public building decorated with frescoes depicting various sexual positions, each accompanied by Latin inscriptions suggesting religious or magical purposes. These weren't mere decorations, but functional religious art, designed to invoke divine protection through the power of sexual imagery. The most famous example comes from the suburban baths of Pompeii, where a series of erotic paintings were discovered in 1986, but only published in 1995. The images show a remarkable variety of sexual activities involving men, women, and various combinations of both. Rather than being simply titillating, scholars now understand these paintings as serving a protective function. They were apotropaic art, designed to ward off evil through the power of sexual imagery. The Roman attitude toward these images becomes clear when you examine how they integrated into daily religious practice. Wealthy Romans didn't hide their erotic art or restrict access to it. Instead, they displayed it prominently and encouraged guests to view it as part of their hospitality. The images served as conversation starters, spiritual protection, and symbols of the household's connection to divine fertility forces. Children grew up seeing these frescoes, learning that sexuality was a natural and sacred aspect of human existence. This acceptance of sexual imagery in religious contexts extended to Rome's most sacred priesthood. The Vestal Virgins, those guardians of Rome's eternal flame, participated in festivals where sexual symbolism played crucial roles. During certain ceremonies, they handled phallic objects, blessed fertility rituals, and oversaw sacrifices that celebrated reproductive power. Their virginity wasn't about sexual shame or purity in the Christian sense. It was about channeling sexual energy in specific religious directions. Recent analysis of Vestal Virgin inscriptions has revealed the complexity of their role in Roman sexual religion. While they maintained personal chastity, they served as intermediaries between humans and fertility deities. Their presence blessed marriages, their prayers ensured successful births, and their rituals channeled sexual energy for the benefit of the entire Roman people. They embodied the Roman understanding that sexuality was too powerful to be ignored or suppressed. It had to be properly directed through religious channels. The archaeological record shows how this integration of sexuality and religion evolved over time. Early Roman erotic art tends to be more explicitly religious, featuring gods, goddesses, and mythological scenes. Later imperial examples become more domesticated, focusing on human sexuality within religious frameworks. This evolution suggests that Romans gradually domesticated divine sexuality, making it more accessible to ordinary people while maintaining its sacred character. By the 3rd century CE, Roman houses routinely contained erotic art alongside traditional religious imagery. A typical wealthy home might feature frescoes of Venus and Mars in the bedroom, Priapus protecting the garden, and various fertility symbols throughout the household. These images weren't pornography in any modern sense. They were religious art that happened to be sexually explicit, designed to invoke divine blessing rather than sexual arousal. This religious framework for sexuality reaches its most extreme expression in the mystery cults that proliferated throughout the Roman Empire. Recent discoveries have shed new light on these secretive religious societies, revealing how they used sexual imagery and ritual to create profound spiritual experiences for their initiates. The most famous of these cults worshipped Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and religious ecstasy, whose rites combined sexual symbolism with intoxication to induce mystical revelation. The Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii contains the most complete surviving example of Dionysiac religious art. The famous fresco cycle, which covers an entire room, depicts the initiation of a young woman into the mysteries of Dionysus. The scenes progress from innocent preparation through increasingly intense ritual experiences, culminating in what appears to be a symbolic sexual union with the god himself. Recent analysis using advanced imaging techniques has revealed details previously invisible, showing how the artists used sexual symbolism to represent spiritual transformation. But the Villa of the Mysteries isn't unique. In 2024, archaeologists working in Pompeii's House of Thyasus discovered another Dionysiac fresco that scholars are calling even more significant than the famous villa paintings. This newly found cycle depicts men and women engaged in mystery rituals that clearly involve sexual symbolism and religious ecstasy. The discovery proves that Dionysiac worship continued in Pompeii decades after the Senate officially banned these cults in 186 BC. The ban itself reveals the tension between official Roman policy and popular religious practice. In 186 BC, following reports of sexual misconduct and political conspiracy, the Senate moved aggressively against Dionysiac worship, executing hundreds of practitioners and destroying their temples. Yet archaeological evidence shows that the cults survived underground, adapting their practices to avoid official scrutiny while maintaining their essential character. The Dionysiac mysteries centered on the belief that sexual ecstasy could induce divine possession and mystical revelation. Initiates underwent ritual experiences designed to break down normal psychological barriers and create direct contact with the divine. These experiences often involved alcohol, sexual imagery, and carefully orchestrated psychological pressure that culminated in what practitioners described as union with Dionysus himself. Recent scholarly analysis of Dionysiac art has revealed the sophisticated theology underlying these practices. The cults weren't simply excuses for sexual indulgence. They were based on complex ideas about the relationship between physical and spiritual reality. Practitioners believed that by experiencing intense physical sensations, including sexual arousal and release, they could transcend normal consciousness and achieve direct knowledge of divine truth. The initiation process typically began with purification rituals that prepared candidates for increasingly intense experiences. Archaeological evidence suggests that these preparatory rites involved fasting, bathing, and meditation designed to heighten psychological sensitivity. The actual mysteries began with theatrical presentations that used sexual imagery to represent spiritual concepts: death and rebirth, human and divine love, the relationship between body and soul. The climax of Dionysiac initiation involved what scholars term sacred marriage, a ritual sexual experience that symbolized the initiate's union with the divine. This wasn't necessarily physical sex, but rather a carefully orchestrated psychological and spiritual event that used sexual symbolism and possibly arousal to create mystical consciousness. Participants described emerging from these experiences fundamentally transformed, with new understanding of reality and their place in the cosmic order. What makes the Dionysiac cults particularly significant is their appeal to women. Unlike most Roman religious institutions, the mysteries offered women genuine spiritual authority and the possibility of direct divine experience. Female initiates could become priestesses with the power to conduct rituals and guide other seekers. The cults provided a religious space where women could explore sexuality and spirituality outside the constraints of Roman marriage and family life. The survival of these cults, despite official persecution, demonstrates their importance to Roman religious life. People risked execution to participate in Dionysiac mysteries, suggesting that they offered spiritual experiences unavailable elsewhere. The combination of sexual symbolism, ecstatic ritual, and mystical revelation created a form of religion that satisfied needs mainstream Roman worship couldn't address. Modern archaeological techniques are revealing new details about how these mystery cults operated. Ground-penetrating radar has located hidden chambers beneath known Roman religious sites, spaces that may have served as secret meeting places for banned cults. Chemical analysis of wine residues from ceremonial vessels has revealed the use of additional substances, possibly psychoactive plants, that enhanced the ecstatic experiences central to mystery religion. The integration of sexuality into Roman mystery cults reflects broader patterns in ancient Mediterranean religion. Similar practices appear in the worship of Cybele, Isis, and Mithras, suggesting that sexual mysticism was a widespread phenomenon rather than an isolated Roman peculiarity. These cults offered alternatives to the public, political religion of the state, providing personal spiritual experiences that emphasized individual transformation through direct divine encounter. As we near the end of our journey through Roman sexual religion, it's crucial to understand how these practices ended and why they disappeared so completely from historical memory. The transformation began in the 4th century CE when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and initiated the slow process of converting the Roman Empire to a very different understanding of sexuality and divinity. But the change wasn't immediate or simple. It took centuries of struggle between competing visions of religious life. The conflict between Christian and traditional Roman approaches to sexuality appears vividly in the surviving correspondence between Pope Gelasius I and Roman Senator Andromachus in 494 CE. The letter, one of the most important documents of religious transition, reveals how desperately some Romans fought to preserve their sexual festivals, even as Christianity gained political power. The Lupercalia had survived over 480 years of official discouragement, continuing to draw participants throughout the early Christian period. Gelasius's letter to Andromachus drips with contempt for traditional Roman religious practices. He describes Lupercalia participants as vile rabble and dismisses their fertility rituals as empty superstition, but the very existence of the letter proves that the festival remained popular enough to concern church authorities. The Pope's sarcastic suggestion that if senators really believed in Lupercalia's power, they should run naked yourselves, reveals both his disgust with the practice and his recognition that it retained significant support among the Roman elite. The Roman Senate's response was telling. They argued that Lupercalia was essential to Rome's safety and well-being, framing the festival not as mere superstition, but as a necessary religious practice that protected the empire. This wasn't just conservative resistance to change, it reflected a genuine belief that abandoning traditional fertility rituals would bring divine punishment and imperial decline. For Romans accustomed to seeing sexuality as sacred, Christian demands to suppress these practices seem not just unreasonable but dangerous. Archaeological evidence reveals how this religious transformation played out in daily life. Excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum show that Christian symbols began appearing alongside traditional Roman religious imagery during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Wealthy Romans hedged their spiritual bets, commissioning mosaics that included both Christian crosses and phallic symbols, unclear which religious system would ultimately prevail. The process of change was gradual and incomplete. Many Roman sexual festivals survived well into the Christian period, adapting their practices to avoid direct confrontation with church authorities. Floralia continued into the 6th century, though prostitutes no longer performed nude in state-sponsored ceremonies. Local fertility festivals persisted in rural areas, gradually acquiring Christian overlays while maintaining their essential character. The Bonadea cult proved particularly resilient. Inscriptions from the 4th and 5th centuries show continued worship of the goddess, though her festivals became more private and less politically prominent. Some scholars argue that elements of her worship survived transformation into Christian practices. The veneration of Mary as Regina and Domina may echo titles once applied to the good goddess. The association of both deities with healing and protection suggests possible continuity beneath surface religious change. But ultimately, Christianity's victory was complete. By the 6th century, the great sexual festivals of Rome had disappeared from the historical record. The mystery cults vanished underground, their initiates scattered or converted. The erotic art that once decorated Roman homes was destroyed, painted over, or locked away in church storage rooms. The integration of sexuality and religion that had characterized Roman spiritual life for over 7 centuries came to an abrupt end. The consequences of this transformation extended far beyond religious practice. Christian emphasis on sexual purity and celibacy fundamentally altered Roman social structures. The Vestal Virgins, once powerful religious figures who channeled sexual energy for the state's benefit, were disbanded. Female religious authority, which had flourished in the mystery cults and goddess worship, largely disappeared. The idea that sexuality could be sacred rather than sinful became not just unfashionable, but heretical. Modern excavations are helping us understand what was lost in this transition. The erotic frescoes discovered in Pompeii, hidden for centuries in museum secret cabinets, reveal artistic traditions that vanished with the end of Roman sexual religion. The sophistication of these works, their integration into domestic and public spaces, their clear religious significance, all demonstrate a completely different approach to sexuality and spirituality than what followed. Recent discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of Roman sexual religion. In 2024, archaeologists working at a villa outside Rome uncovered what appears to be a Christian household that retained traditional Roman erotic art well into the 5th century CE. The discovery suggests that the transition from pagan to Christian sexuality was more complex and gradual than previously thought, with some families maintaining dual religious practices for generations. But perhaps the most significant recent discovery occurred in 2023, when construction workers renovating a Roman church uncovered a hidden chamber containing dozens of intact ritual objects from a Dionysiac mystery cult. The cache, apparently hidden during 4th century persecutions, includes silver cups decorated with explicitly sexual imagery, ceremonial masks used in initiation rituals, and scrolls describing practices that scholars thought were lost forever. The discovery proves that some practitioners of Roman sexual religion survived the Christian transformation, preserving their traditions in secret for decades or even centuries. These findings force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about historical memory. The version of Roman religion taught in schools and universities focused on state ceremonies, public sacrifices, and political functions represents only half the story. The other half, the realm of sexual spirituality and erotic mysticism, was systematically suppressed and erased from historical consciousness. We've inherited a sanitized version of Roman religion that ignores its most powerful and transformative elements. The implications extend beyond ancient history. Understanding how Romans integrated sexuality into religious life challenges modern assumptions about the relationship between body and spirit, desire and divinity. Their festivals, mysteries, and rituals demonstrate that sexual expression can serve spiritual rather than merely physical purposes. The art they created shows sexuality as sacred rather than shameful, as a source of divine blessing rather than moral corruption. As we stand in the ruins of Pompeii today, looking at the recently uncovered frescoes that gleam with colors as vibrant as the day they were painted, we can almost hear the echoes of those vanished festivals. The Lupercalia priests racing naked through the streets, their bodies glistening with sacred blood. The women of the Bonadea cult, drinking forbidden wine in Caesar's house, claiming religious authority their society otherwise denied them. The Dionysiac initiates experiencing mystical union through carefully orchestrated sexual ritual. The prostitutes of Floralia dancing in the Circus Maximus, their nude bodies celebrating the return of spring and the renewal of life. These weren't primitive peoples driven by uncontrolled lust or crude fertility magic. They were sophisticated Romans who created the legal systems, architectural techniques, and governmental structures that still influence our world today. Their integration of sexuality into religious life reflected complex theological ideas about the nature of divinity, the relationship between physical and spiritual reality, and the role of pleasure in human spiritual development. The Roman approach to sexual religion offers alternatives to the dualistic thinking that has dominated Western spirituality for over 15 centuries. Their festivals demonstrated that sacred and profane need not be separate categories, that sexual desire can serve spiritual purposes, that the body can be a temple rather than a prison for the soul. Their art showed that erotic imagery can protect rather than corrupt, that sexual pleasure can be a form of prayer rather than a distraction from it. Modern pagans and practitioners of alternative spirituality often look to ancient Rome for inspiration, seeking to reconstruct practices that honor sexuality as sacred. While we cannot recreate the specific cultural context that made Roman sexual religion meaningful to its practitioners, we can learn from their fundamental insight that human sexuality, properly understood and reverently practiced, can serve as a bridge between the human and divine realms. The archaeological record continues to yield new evidence about Roman sexual religion. Each excavation season brings fresh discoveries that complicate our understanding and reveal new facets of practices we thought we understood. The Villa of the Mysteries may have been just one example of a widespread phenomenon of domestic mystery cults. The Bona Dea festivals may have included rituals we can barely imagine. The integration of erotic art into public spaces may reflect theological concepts we're only beginning to grasp. What's certain is that Roman sexual religion represented one of history's most sophisticated attempts to integrate human sexuality into a comprehensive spiritual worldview. For 7 centuries, Romans developed practices, created art, and built institutions that honored sexual desire as a sacred force rather than a necessary evil. They understood something about the relationship between sexuality and spirituality that we're still struggling to rediscover. The festivals are silent now. The mystery cults have vanished. The erotic art lies buried beneath centuries of Christian disapproval. But the questions Romans explored through their sexual religion remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. What is the relationship between body and soul? Can sexual pleasure serve spiritual purposes? How do we honor our physical nature while seeking transcendent meaning? Their answers, preserved in archaeological fragments and half-remembered myths, suggest possibilities we've barely begun to explore. As the sun sets over the ruins of the Roman Forum, where naked Lupercalia priests once ran with sacred goat hide, where senators defended their right to maintain fertility festivals, where an empire that ruled the known world built its spiritual life around the integration of sexuality and religion, we're left with a profound sense of what was lost when Christianity transformed Western spirituality. The Romans created something unique in human history, a religious system that celebrated rather than suppressed human sexuality, that saw erotic art as sacred rather than shameful, that understood sexual pleasure as a pathway to the divine rather than an obstacle to spiritual development. Understanding this lost world doesn't require us to romanticize Roman society or ignore its many injustices. Slavery, patriarchy, and exploitation were as much a part of Roman life as sexual festivals and erotic art. But recognizing the sophistication of Roman sexual religion does force us to question assumptions about the relationship between sexuality and spirituality that have shaped Western thought for over a millennium. It suggests that the integration of erotic and sacred body and soul, pleasure and transcendence may be not only possible, but necessary for a complete spiritual life. The story of how ancient Rome turned sex into a public spectacle and called it religion is ultimately a story about human possibility, about a civilization that dared to imagine sexuality as sacred, desire as divine, and pleasure as prayer. Their festivals may be forever silenced, but their vision of integrated human sexuality and spirituality continues to illuminate possibilities for those brave enough to look beyond the boundaries of conventional religious thought. In the end, perhaps that's the greatest gift the Romans left us. Not just roads and laws and architectural techniques, but the revolutionary idea that human sexuality, in all its complexity and power, might be not the enemy of the sacred, but its most intimate expression. What would happen if we took that idea seriously? What if we stopped seeing sexuality and spirituality as competing forces and started understanding them as complementary aspects of human wholeness? What if we honored our bodies as temples rather than prisons, our desires as guidance rather than temptation, our pleasure as prayer rather than sin? The Romans showed us one way to answer these questions. The archaeological evidence of their sexual religion, emerging from centuries of burial and suppression, suggests that the integration of sexuality and spirituality may be not just possible, but essential for human flourishing. Standing in the shadow of Vesuvius, surrounded by the ruins of a civilization that dared to make sexuality sacred, we're confronted with a choice. We can continue to see the Romans as cautionary examples of sexual excess, or we can recognize them as pioneers who explored possibilities we've barely begun to imagine. Their legacy isn't just stone and mortar. It's a vision of human sexuality as divine gift rather than necessary burden, of erotic art as spiritual protection rather than moral corruption, of sexual pleasure as a pathway to transcendence rather than an obstacle to it. The festivals of ancient Rome may be forever silenced, but their message echoes across the centuries. Sexuality and spirituality need not be enemies. In the right hands, with the right understanding, guided by the right intentions, human sexual energy can become not just a force for procreation or pleasure, but a bridge between the human and divine realms. That's the real story of how ancient Rome turned sex into a public spectacle and called it religion. Not a tale of ancient decadence, but a bold experiment in human spiritual possibility that we are still learning to understand.